Welcome to The Future Work, the series where we're looking hard at how we can actually improve the conditions for independent workers throughout the economy here. Looking forward. We're doing this with Reinvent, a company, media company here, of which I'm the founder, in partnership with Intuit, who's got a real interest in thinking through ways we can actually really transform this space in the coming years. And today we're actually going to have a deep dive interview with Carmen Rojas, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Workers Lab. And this is essentially an organization that invests in entrepreneurs, technologists, community organizers, nonprofits, all of which are trying to work on scalable solutions for improving the conditions of low-wage workers. And that's something that we're really interested in this series, and we're really happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell me, we're going to talk about the Workers Lab for sure, but just give me a little bit about your background, because what impressed me is you've really had a kind of a systematic look at this space that we're really trying to understand. I think it'd be useful to just kind of give us a little sense of how you've been educated yourself over the last
honestly, first and foremost, it was a couple blocks from here. So my parents are immigrants. They immigrated to this Mission of San Francisco. My mom worked at the last Levi's factory here in the Mission, and then got a job cleaning an office building at 1 South Van Ness. And it was at that job that she was then offered a job working at the building, which was a bank. And the bank at that time offered her like workplace training, offered her benefits for the first time, a living wage. And for its employees, the bank offered no interest loans to buy a house. And so I often think about my mom, or my mom is the central character of the story of change that I see, in large part because we still need people to make our clothes. We still need people to clean our buildings. We still need people to work at banks and to work at restaurants. And when my mom immigrated, that job essentially allowed her a footstep into the middle class. It created the room for her to buy her first house, for me to go to graduate school. Like, the world was really open to her. And today, working people in those same exact jobs don't have that opportunity, and are often sort of making impossible choices between childcare and healthcare, are making impossible choices between taking care of a loved one or feeding your children. And so I founded the Workers Lab really because I refuse to be the last generation of people that gets to benefit from that. So that gets to benefit from the promise of working 40 hours and being able to provide for your family and have a sort of a vision and hope, and realize that vision and hope for the future.
Well, that's interesting. So give us a sense of what is the Workers Lab? I kind of gave the basic framing, but you explain what you do.
We're a lab. So I often sort of ask people to imagine like a science lab where people are experimenting and trying new ways to solve all kinds of problems. Our problems are just the problems confronting working people. So we are not focused on any specific industry or sector. We're not focused on any place. We see workers regardless of classification, so we're interested in both W-2 and 1099 contractors. We see working people as a lifeblood of our country and want to make sure that they can live with dignity, have mobility and opportunity. And so what we do is raise money from philanthropic institutions and labor unions, and use that money to support people with great ideas, to test them out, and where there is some traction to be able to scale those ideas and realize them, make them real.
So when you say working people, so because people work at all levels of society, but how do you define that more? And I framed it a little more. You're looking more on the lower end of the economic spectrum. So talk about that a little bit.
So for us, we are when we started, we use the language of low-wage work to describe sort of the largest sectors of our economy. So 50%, almost 50% of workers earn less than $15 an hour. If that's the case, then we want to focus on half of the people who work in this country. And those are people, who do everything from care for the elderly to work in restaurants. And so we are looking at that group, looking at the bottom 50% of working people.
And just roughly people making less than $15 an hour.
Yeah.
Do you, because a lot of the theme of this series has been looking at independent workers in the meaning in the broadest sense. From our point of view, contract workers, that can be high-end, 1099 contract workers. It could be temp workers, could be Uber gig workers. I mean, so how much of your world do you think of as independent or not?
The vast majority. I think that the way that people have articulated sort of a distinction between W-2 workers and 1099 contractors, I think for most working people is false. I don't think that, I think the person who works at McDonald's and drives for Uber, it doesn't like switch automatically. And I think that there are more and more people who are living sort of these double lives on the one side. And then on the other side, I think that there are a set of benefits that we imagine low-wage W-2 workers having that are really difficult to enforce and to get. So, and we have sort of idealized W-2 work in particular for those sets of protections. But, if there are health and safety protections and you work in the state of Texas and there are only 2 ocean inspectors for the entire state, what does it mean that you have these protections if they're not enforced? And so we are, frankly, like classification agnostic. I think that the vast majority of people earning less than a certain amount of this in this country are really suffering. And so I'm more interested in responding to how people see themselves than to like creating an arbitrary category that they think is ridiculous or frankly don't know about.
And so people, what you're implying there is people don't see that distinction in those people working in those spaces. They don't think, oh, I'm a W-2 worker.
I don't think so. Like I've heard of a number of cases in the fast food industry in particular where workers are asked to clock out and keep on working, right? That's illegal. But who does that worker call? And is that worker willing to risk their job to get back that $30 and then possibly not get another job at another fast food company? Like the barriers to accessing the rights that are available for low-wage W-2 workers are so high that I think that the distinction between W-2 and 1099 is one that legally exists and is limited. It's not enforced in full, especially for the lowest paid workers.
That's
like provocative.
There's so many ways to go with this, but I just want to flesh it out a little bit because you're right. There is this idealized idea about, if you have a job, there's this kind of world of protections. And what you're saying here, just to be clear, is that may well be true, particularly for people in the upper echelons of the economy, but that is increasingly not true, not because mostly because it's been neglected or not followed up or not enforced. Is
That's right.
Way to say it?
Yeah, that we have laws that lack I'll tell you a story. So when we started the Workers Lab 3 years ago, we had a number of cities across the country pass minimum wage laws, increasing minimum wage from anywhere to $12 to $15. Mm-hmm. And the first set of applicants for resources were organizations who had passed the law and now were looking for money for enforcing those laws. And that just seemed absurd to me. Like when I think about my mom, and my mom goes to the ballot box and votes for something, she assumes that if she voted for minimum wage to be increased and it was increased, that it would then be increased for workers. But it turns out that we actually need people in government that are enforcing the implementation of these laws. And if you are a low-wage worker, if you're an immigrant worker, if you're a worker who's previously been incarcerated and feel like you have limited rights, who's to tell you, if your boss comes and tells you this is for everybody but you, who's to tell you anything different if that's been your experience? And so for us at the Workers Lab, we're trying to figure out how to actually create a state of work, regardless of classification, that allows people to, again, not have to make impossible choices, but actually take care of themselves and their families.
So what are the kind of things are you considering under this state of work framework?
So when we started the Workers Lab, one of the things that we were really focused on were like just real-time wages, how much money people earn, and it became increasingly evident that people who work aren't only thinking about their wages, but they're also thinking about debt and assets and savings. And the current sort of labor movement, worker movement isn't thinking about the range of real-time financial needs that working people have. So we are interested in thinking about the state of work, not sort of in aspirational terms, but in real terms. And for us, that means really taking into account the fact that less than 50% of workers, between 45 and 48% of working people have access to $500 in case of an emergency. And
only 48 or up to 48 have access, and meaning the others don't.
48% of workers don't have access to $500. So let's say your car breaks down, your kid gets sick. In some cities, if you lose your Metro card, you're done. Your savings are done. So we've been sort of trying an experiment where we're trying to figure out, okay, if the new state of work requires us to address this issue, the lack of savings, real-time savings that people have, what does it mean to actually have an emergency bucket of money for people to access? What kind of money should it be? Should it be debt? Should it be free? Should it be a match savings account? Who pays into that? And should employers pay, or should consumers pay? And to actually try something out. So the idea is that we answer these set of questions, and later next year, later in 2018, we'll actually put out something. We've raised enough money to put it out for free and see if people will actually use it. So if it's a match savings account, we would match that savings. If it's no interest debt, for 3 months, then we would put the sort of first round of money in for it. But I think in the context for the safety net and the state of work is that, most working people, especially low-wage workers, aren't thinking about the benefits that they get from working that we imagine from another time, which are eventually retiring, being able to save enough money to take care of one's kids and family. Right now, the vast majority of working people aren't thinking about retirement. They're thinking about emergency money. And so for us, we want to respond to that real state of work in order to be able to get to the aspirations of retirement that many people have, but will never get to.
So I mean, have you codified, not codified is maybe the wrong word, but are there 6 pieces of the new state of work?
That's a great question.
Or are there kind of, what are the pieces there? I'm curious, because we're actually also really interested in that in this project. I mean, we kind of could tease them out here. You said wages and debt benefits, debt and assets. There's something about retirement, family, taking care of family. I don't know. Have you done that kind of
No, but
thing?
I definitely should.
But tell us about the things, the kind of things you're talking about in that then. Maybe.
So I feel like there are 2 real things. One is being able to understand what the role of employers are. What is the role of employers in relationship to workers in the current economy. And I don't think we know that. I feel like there's been a huge shift, frankly, a sea change in how employers see themselves as stewards, or as having a shared fate with their workers. That just no longer exists, and in large parts because our economy has changed. It's for a number of reasons, but it's actually redefining that stewardship role, not against stewardship, but actually redefining it. The second is trying to think about the ways that we build power for working people. So if in the 20th century, 1980, 20% of workers were unionized. Today we're at 7% union density. If in the 80s, if between the 60s and the 80s, we were able to build a middle class because of labor unions, what are like the new set of worker institutions or organizations that need to be in place that allow us to build the kind of prosperity that labor unions once allowed us to build? So I feel like we see it less as a taxonomy, like you're describing, or a codification, and more like, what are the 2 sides to this one coin? And for us, we're really focused on the second piece, which are like, what are the new ways to build power for working people in this economy?
Well, that's a great place to go into. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So you see, you mentioned your co-founder was coming out of the labor movement. I mean, how do you think about that? Do you think about it as revitalizing the labor movement, or do you think of it as totally new institutions? Or
Totally new
okay.
institutions and approaches. So we do everything but for collective bargaining. So we look at things like, in California, our biggest project is working with the 10th largest agricultural company in the country. They're experiencing a labor shortage like most agricultural companies are in this time and have been, because people aren't immigrating to work in fields, and are trying to figure out how do they keep their workers in their fields, because they need their workers. And they came to us, and we discovered really quickly that workers are being shortchanged. Their relationship with the grower is mediated by a contractor, so they are the original gig workers. They were not having the employer, even the grower wanted to provide ESL classes to the workers and couldn't, because they had sort of a bright line between the workers and the growers, which were the contractors. So we spent some time and we're like, okay, let's create a new labor model. And we landed on something that we're calling the California Harvesters, which is a trust, essentially a labor co-op that is owned and run by the workers. The workers, for the first time ever, will be able to negotiate salary and wages. They will be getting paid 10% above prevailing wage for the industry. For the first time, we'll have access to health benefits across the board. And for me, what's most exciting is that the grower has committed to giving them 5% equity in the company. And so these are 2,500 overwhelmingly immigrant, a good number of undocumented workers who have been working in these fields. The average time span has been 10 years and have seen very little benefit to their work but survival. And this idea that they go back home and build a house or are taken care of somewhere else, where the money that they're making here is like subsistence money. We have sort of introduced this model, and it's where our first 250 workers will join the trust in January, and it'll scale to 2,500 by the end of next year. And again, I believe this will be transformational, that the workers will not only get to do the type of negotiation that labor once offered, but then will actually be partial owners, that they will have vested interest in the success of the company, and the company will have vested interest in their success. And so we're looking at models like that, where I believe, and my team believes, that we can transform an entire industry because the market is creating an opportunity to do that, and we're just responding. Yeah.
So just to be clear there, so that relationship between the grower, instead of hiring a contractor who then essentially contracted with all these workers, the middleman contractor is out of the picture, and now he's essentially committing to this new organization.
Yep.
And how do they think of? So are the workers independent workers in our terms? A part of that, or are they somehow employees? Okay.
So when we brought together the team of people, the grower came to us, and we brought together a team of people that were like, nobody quite knows. We were like all blind people touching the elephant. And then we brought together the nation's leading cooperative development organization, Democracy at Work Institute, the Working World, which does sort of cooperative development and finance. They're really amazing. A group of lawyers. We brought together an immigrant rights and education organization from the Central Valley, a Latino political organization, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a group in Florida that did sort of a similar negotiation with growers in the industry. In our initial round, we brought together this sort of ragtag group of blind people touching the elephant, and really quickly discovered that we could intervene and create a different model, frankly, by describing the elephant to each other and saying, I'm at the front and I feel the trunk, and finding the places where there were inefficiencies in the current model. So what's common knowledge is that when working people are doing well, when they're getting paid enough, when they have benefits, when they have voice in their workplace, the companies are doing well. There's like a a false choice that I feel like companies are making in this moment, which is between making sure that employees are doing well and profits. And we're proving that wrong. We're proving that choice to be a false choice. And really wanting to offer employers, and on the one side, but also working people, the opportunity to shape the places that they spend the vast majority of their time.
So that new entity you're talking about,
Yeah.
you did you refer to it as a cooperative? Is that how you
It's
say
a
so describe what
it's
is
a
that?
trust. So it would be a cooperative, but we discovered that if it was a cooperative, then we would expose undocumented workers to a set of like IRS visibility that we didn't want to do that. They would have to individually be individual members of a co-op. And what we didn't want to do is, by creating a new labor model, expose workers to, especially undocumented workers, to a set of risks because of the current and previous immigration climate. So the trust acts like is a body of elected workers that negotiates with the grower that all workers benefit from.
And the equity that the entity has.
Yep.
By the way, is that entity like I guess as a trust, like a nonprofit?
Yeah.
So it has 5% equity,
Yep.
or however you said it. How does that can get distributed or
So they
connect
can
to the workers?
choose. They can say
meaning
the
elected
workers.
leaders? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
the workers can say we want. It's quarterly disbursement, so we thought about it early on and thought, okay, if we give people like a yearly disbursement, usually people don't need money yearly. People need money more sooner. And then it's like not the days of the Mad Men bonus. People have sort of more financial friction in their life. So it's a quarterly disbursement. They can decide to get paid out. They can decide to use that money to invest in housing. They can decide to invest that money in schools or after school programs or ESL programs. They can decide to do whatever they want with that money. Yeah.
Now, how much do you think that model is replicable in other situations?
We have 3 other growers. So we have 3 other growers who have approached us with the interest of replicating the model. And so, funnily enough, one of the farms aren't what I imagine them to be, which is like Farmer Carmen on the farm growing her grapes with her workers. Most farms and sort of large agricultural holdings are owned by asset management companies. And so one of our partners from the asset management company that owns the farm left her job with the intention of actually building a trust replication company.
Oh, fantastic.
There's like so much interest in agriculture right now to think about how to address the issues of labor supply, which is dwindling. Yeah.
Fascinating. I guess what I was meant, so it's replicable certainly in the industry, but how replicable is it outside that industry?
Oh, that's a great question.
Other
Yeah.
industries now? Or
So
have you
this
thought
is
about
my
that, or-
hunch. Yeah.
Okay.
So my hunch is that it's very replicable, and it's like we're a lab, so it's like a science experiment. So like, what were the inputs that created this output? It was contractors, a relationship. There was where you had a contractor with one big client. So in this case, it was our grower, but it could be like a stadium that contracts with the janitorial company to come in, or a set of janitorial companies to come and do different parts of the cleaning of the stadium. It can be where there's a contractor or a reliance on immigrant workers, or where there's a tightness in the labor market. One sole employer that's already paid somebody to do this before and is willing to pay this new entity to do it again. So I'm like looking at stadiums. I'm looking at big places where something has a big footprint. That thing uses more than one contractor to do the same thing. Janitorial is one, security guards are another. And trying to figure out if we can get somebody to help us figure out if we can replicate it in other traditionally low-wage contracting industry, low-earning contracting industries. Yeah.
Fascinating. I mean, and this model of the equity piece, because
Yeah.
that's something that's come up in other interviews. Is that how big a deal? How big is that? Just a nice bonus? That's isn't that awesome? Or is it something central to the idea?
Oh, I think it's central.
So, say more about it.
So I think it helps expand. Yeah, workers aren't thinking just about wages, they're thinking about assets and debt. And so imagine if you're a worker who can say you are a partial owner of this farm that gets, you're a member or owner of this trust, co-owner of this trust that gets this disbursement in equity that has sort of X amount of money in the bank. You can go to a bank and say, hey, I want to take a loan out for a house, or I want to take a loan out for a car. Your ability to think about your financial life is radically different if you have an asset like that. And so for us, cooperatives are really, really important. We've been looking a lot at things like certification. So in Texas, we've been working with an immigrant worker rights group that we're entering our third year to establish a certification company for the construction industry. So at its worst, every day a construction worker dies in Texas. There are 2 OSHA inspectors for the entire state of Texas, and there's no required workers' compensation. And so this group has been trying to do advocacy and organizing of construction workers, and they've been really great, but it's been tough to move the actual needle. And they came up with this idea of a startup, of a company, of an enterprise that would essentially offer developers the training, monitoring, and certification that they would be doing as a nonprofit. But in exchange, the developers would get a reduced permitting time. So if developers agreed to sign on, then they would work with developers to reduce their permitting time from 90 days to 30 days. This group 3 years ago was an Austin-based group, and now they're in Austin, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. They are generating around $250,000 a month on the for-profit side. That allows them to give money to the nonprofit. I feel like certification, again, is really interesting and exciting. We sort of started thinking about things like regional bargaining. So like San Francisco, for example, has retail worker bill of rights. What does that mean? How do you enforce it? What does a like regional bargaining look like, or entire industry level bargaining look like? This year, we're moving into next year, we're going to start looking at like workforce development and training. It's like $1 trillion is spent training people. A lot of that money is lost in training people for jobs that don't exist, or jobs that won't exist in the next 5 or 10 years. And so we're interested in trying to figure out, if that money exists, how do we use it for better? And how do we actually respond to the future labor needs of our economy, and make sure that we're responding not to that, but to the needs of workers as well.
So you're a lab, kind of like an incubator kind of lab,
Yeah, that's a great question.
So you kind of you teed up all these awesome opportunity spaces, essentially.
Yeah.
And so people would come to you with an idea and say, hey, I'm in this space, I want to try it, and you would invest in them, is that what you do? And then help them bring the idea up? Or do you actually also have an idea like, hey, we want to do this, and you go out and find the people to do it?
Once a year we'll do that. Once a year we're like,
you do the latter one?
Once a year we're like, oh, this is something that keeps coming up. So this project on getting people emergency money, we just kept getting pulled into the conversation around portable benefits. And it felt like both the conversation around portable benefits and around universal basic income, those 2 conversations are conversations we consistently got pulled in, and it just felt like a mismatch from where people actually were, which is not thinking about long-term benefits like retirement or long-term saving benefits, but actually thinking about emergency money. So once a year, we'll come up with something and we'll work on, but most of the time we do like open applications. So I would think about it as like an arc or a pyramid where about a half of our money goes to experimentation. We'll do open applications, and anybody can apply for money, for-profit, nonprofit, individual, and we'll give you, frankly, just money. Like we see money as like a humongous barrier that people shouldn't have to try new things. And so if something has some traction, then we'll validate, the experimentation, validation. And in the validation, you get matched with an entrepreneur who can help you do everything from develop a profit and loss statement, think about branding. We have lawyers that we work with. We have an amazing branding firm here in San Francisco that you get access to. So it's like money plus. And then if you're like this project in Texas or the project here in California, we commit to give funding over 3 years. And we commit to raising and giving about $250,000 a year to the project for 3 years, with the idea that like people need a runway, and raising money is like it's a slog. It's always, and it's like it's a specific kind of job, and we're really good at it, and we want to make sure that those people who have these great ideas can actually focus on their job and not focus on the raising money part.
So here you are kind of seeing this whole environment and all these new ideas and these new spaces. So what we're kind of leveraging in this interview is your expertise of kind of the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
So a couple of things I wanted to just tease out of what you've laid out there. The model, so you said this model, for example, of a trust kind of entity,
Yeah.
connecting up contractors
Yeah.
and dealing with big corporations,
Yep.
including getting equity from those things, is happening in the agricultural space,
Yep.
and it's being replicated.
Yep.
And then you mentioned it, okay, in the other low wage areas like janitorial for stadiums and stuff, there's a lot of commonality in that,
Yep.
so it's potentially there. Do you think, because this is a larger thing for the whole economy, do you think that model could actually scale into gig workers, Uber, Lyft drivers, or other spaces that are beyond the space that you're working in, particularly with these lower wage workers? I mean, it seems like there's some kind of there's very similar needs there, not maybe the desperation of the $500, but there is a kind of a level of worker voice, some kind of collective kind of way to get equity in these companies. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Or have you thought about that?
Yeah, no, I know I have. The hard thing about, so like if we take contracting broadly, that's a really ripe space, I think, for innovation and change, right? So this trust is something that can be replicated for care workers, for sort of the largest co-op in the country is a home care co-op in New York. So we see promise in traditional contracting relationships where the business that they're negotiating with is negotiable. I feel like the challenge with the gig companies is like a small fraction of the entire universe of the contracting space is frankly like how they're capitalized, how
with VC money
and
big return
needs
for big
like
return.
the expectations that's it, right? That there has been a resurgence of a logic of shareholder primacy or shareholder value
in the tech world?
The tech world, in a way that is like rippling out to other parts of our economy, and we're seeing it like with things like American Airlines. I don't know if you saw this recently, but their shareholders complained, and one of their somebody was trading American Airlines stock, and they had their biggest complaint was that they raised wages for their employees, and were pulling employees' interest before shareholder value. Again, I think it's a false choice, right? It's I think so one is how they're capitalized in terms of shareholders, and whether or not shareholders will allow companies to do that. The other thing that sort of frankly, like I have the question about, and I've been thinking a lot about with this emergency savings account, is like who pay, like should employers be on the hook for paying everything for workers? And I sort of often think about healthcare, and feel like when employers are solely on the hook for paying for everything, they work really quickly to dismantle it. And wonder what it looks like instead to have the state pay for things, and to, I was telling the story this morning to somebody, but I lived in Venezuela for a year, and what was really striking to me was that anytime Hugo Chavez planted a tree or fixed a street, or like you had a sense that there was a picture of him, there was a sense that government was working and did something for you. And in the US context, I feel like we've really lost that. Both, well, definitely conservatives have lost, I don't even know if they've ever had an orientation or perspective about the state and what the state does. But I also think liberals to progressives have lost the role of government and of sort of the role of government as being a steward of public good, of the public good. And I wonder, instead of asking, let's say, Lyft or Uber to pay into this thing, why don't we just tax Lyft or Uber enough to be able to pay into a benefit for workers that's distributed en masse by government? And I sort of to the
That's a totally interesting. Well, let's talk about this a little bit because here we are in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
We're literally in the Mission here, as you mentioned, San Francisco. Your thing is over in East Bay in Oakland.
Yeah.
So we're kind of surrounded by this tech community, and we interact with them all the time. How open do you think the actual people running those companies or the people in those companies would be towards more of a rebalancing within the companies? And even for that matter, the VCs and the people with money open to a kind of shifting back against that shareholder primacy. You mentioned, for example, just to start the interview, how back in the day, companies had this sense of connection to their, or responsibility towards employees.
Yep.
It's been lost, and
Yep.
we can talk about, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'm just trying to understand your own insight into the climate now. Do you feel there's a moment of kind of openness to rebalancing, that the kind of problems you don't? Okay, well, tell me. Maybe.
I mean,
say why not.
yeah. So we are really lucky in that we get to partner with a number of really amazing people and organizations. And one of the organizations that I really love working with is one in New York called Data in Society. And Dana Boyd, who runs Data in Society, often tells this story that sticks with me, which is about the start or emergence of gig work, starting with engineers at tech companies. And she talks about how when startups sort of in 2001, and frankly more recently, when startups were when technology startups were starting to gain sort of traction and momentum, what they would do is say to an engineer who can get a job at some place like Lockheed Martin or AT&T or wherever it is that they would get a job as an engineer and get paid really well with benefits, they would say, hey, instead of taking that job where you have this, you're getting paid the real value of your work, instead of getting these benefits, we're going to give you this thing called equity into this company. And we're going to pay you half as much as what you deserve. But the promise is that this company is going to be the next Facebook, and then you're going to be a billionaire. So like, just assume some of the risk, shoulder some of the risk of this startup in service of creating this company. And I feel like not only have the heads of these companies, but the entire industry has adopted a logic of displacing burden onto workers, all kinds of workers, in order to see the rise of a set of companies. And it's frankly like distorting. 1 in every 1,000 startups takes off. So that leaves 999 startups with engineers that shouldered the burden, that for X number of years weren't getting paid their true market value because of a promise and because somebody said, hey, take a bet or take a risk on us. I feel like that bet and risk gets bigger and weightier when you go from being the engineer at Lyft to being the driver at Lyft. But it's still the same burden. So I don't see any evidence, frankly. And what is even scarier is that people are now describing themselves as entrepreneurs across the spectrum, right? So the engineer who is the engineer at the startup is like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, I work at this startup company. And then the driver who drives for an Uber as a contractor is like, I'm an entrepreneur, I have my own business, I drive my own Uber car. The tech sector has been really influential in reusing or recasting the language that we use to describe work. And it's not okay just to be like, I'm a worker who works for Peter. It's like, I'm an entrepreneur who is a subcontractor for Peter, but I have my business, I have my hustle. And I feel like that lowers the set of expectations that working people and frankly that companies have for what their role is in making sure that our economy and that our country are doing well.
So if you don't have much confidence there, which is you make a very compelling case. If the answer isn't going to come from real magnanimous leadership and kind of redirection from the heights of let's just say the tech world or the innovation economy, that kind of goes back to your other insight, which is maybe we need to restructure systems dependent more on government.
Yeah.
And I know if you've been, people have been the last 30 years in American politics seems to be, with all the conservative kind of dominance of at least, national politics, it doesn't seem a very fruitful environment. But I do feel, my own feeling is that there is another era that's opening up here that potentially you could imagine more government moving more into the center of that. We're seeing the interest in single payer. And
Yeah.
we're starting to see, and even California recently is doing a lot of things. Actually, it's taking government's taking a more prominent role.
Yeah.
So is that your thinking as well?
Yeah,
Or
no,
talk more
course.
about where you see the answers maybe coming in this that way.
I mean, we're talking about universal Medicare. Like this is, it's amazing, right? It's amazing that literally 12 months ago, it was poison to talk about something like universal health care. And now we have not only Bernie Sanders, but Kamala Harris and Cory Booker signing up to support legislation for universal health care. I think that as one part, this is what you're describing, as one part of our world is being shifted and changed. I think it's
the private sector.
Yeah, and I think it's the private sector, and I think it's sort of large private sector. Like you think, Google is a great example. Google in the United States has more contractors than employees. And so what does that mean when a company like that is behaving that way? It's not like they can't afford to have employees. They're making a choice to have more contractors than employees. But on the other side, the promise that I see is that people in government have been called on to do better. And they're doing it. And whether or not, either through universal health care, be it through, there are like so many interesting just conversations, like 4 years ago, it was impossible. It was ridiculous to talk about $15 an hour. Now people are saying, actually, what is a living wage? If $15 an hour in San Francisco actually really isn't much. Right? Actually, in most places where the vast majority of poor working people live, it's not enough. And so what is enough? And how do we make sure that people do have enough? I think that there's a way in which along the liberal to progressive spectrum, people have been called on to do better, and they're doing it. And I think California in particular, but I look at other places that are like cities across the country that are at the leading edge of reimagining what a just economy looks like. You had Mayor Tubbs here. Like Mayor Tubbs is really an exciting...
Which is the Mayor
of Stockton. Yeah, that's right. But he's like I feel like the future of politics in this country, and is really open to that future. And unlike many sort of staid politicians, he's really open to taking and shaping that future. And I think we're seeing so much more of that now than ever, frankly.
You had referenced California. Say more about what you think is happening here in the politics and government. Because again, I think people don't, particularly people outside the state, politics is kind of being framed as the polarized, paralyzed national government. So say more about what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and we have a sanctuary state. We're California is a leader in the U.S. in climate change, that we are sort of using our not even bully pulpit, our pulpit as the 5th largest economy in the world, to set a standard and have seen, I think, ourselves as a state, as a beacon, not just for people in this country, but as a global beacon. I am really hopeful that that will translate into some benefits for workers. So we're seeing sort of a bunch of upcoming rulings in the not too far future around this 1099 W-2 work and gig companies.
What are you referring to, national?
Yeah, here in California. So there's a case. I want to say GitHub, but I know that that's wrong. It's a food delivery tech company that is, workers have sued. There's a class action lawsuit around misclassification. That is, the ruling comes down in late October. And let's hope that there's, that sort of continues the progressive movement here in California. But I think that there's a political climate that is so promising here. What worries me is that we're also living in a place where the political climate is really promising and the economic climate is dystopic. Frankly, like we're here in San Francisco, where it's the greatest income inequality in the country. We have seen mass displacement of people. We don't have enough housing or transportation, and so I feel like the private sector really is being extended the same invitation to do better, and we'll know in the very near term whether or not they will do that.
That's a good way to frame it. So in your estimation, just your analysis, the public sector right now is really stepping up and doing some pretty big swing responses to these, not just around workers, but all kinds of things. Which, by the way, I do share that. I agree with that. But in your estimation, the private sector, particularly the really powerful tech companies and innovation economy folks, are not living up to that same kind of forward thinking,
to the full weight of their power, right?
And you're, in fact, you seem to be not very confident that that's going to change.
I mean, I feel like we're celebrating very small victories. So a big announcement was made earlier this week that Mark Benioff of Salesforce is going to invest $12.5 million into schools in the Bay Area. You know, $12.5 million is to Mark Benioff? Not much. And given the impact in terms of the number of people he has working at his company that use our roads, who send their kids to our schools, that frankly are like the weight of a company like Salesforce and the sheer amount of money they have, that seems to be mismatched. But we celebrate it because it's better to get something than nothing. And I wonder what it looks like when we ask for the something that we want instead of the nothing or little bit that we get.
When you say the something, throw out any thoughts on
$1 billion.
Yeah. So
there's no reason why San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose have failing schools. There's no reason. There's no reason why our schools are deeply segregated in terms of outcomes. There's no reason why our public university system, Berkeley, the Cal State system, continues to be sort of in a financial shortage when a lot of the people who work at these companies benefited from them being public institutions, right? I think that this is where I wonder maybe the edge of where government is doing great. I'm really curious to see who's going to tax. We have a whole new generation of billionaires, multi-millionaires here in the state of California. I am really curious to see who is running for state office that is going to have frankly, what it's going to take is like courage to call on those people to pay their fair share, because they haven't been paying their fair share up until now. Yeah.
There is signs just in California, both through initiatives and the legislature and Governor Brown, that the attitude towards taxes is shifting for sure. We've gone from that no new taxes,
the Prop 13
crazy day stuff, to now there is a kind of to the idea of progressive taxation, although I'm far short of, like you're saying, the shifts that we need. But anyhow, it's interesting. We'll see that. Now we're getting towards the end of the interview, but I do want to explore one thing that emerged here. And I'm curious on where you fall here, because different people see this differently. Like there was in a world of the W-2 wage worker that was kind of perfected in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And there has been an increasing number of contract workers. And I would say in this conversation so far, we've been framing it as a kind of a negative thing for a lot of good reasons, particularly when it impacts low-wage workers. But there are other people who talk about the idea of that just pushing everyone back into 40-hour weeks, inflexible schedules, 9 to 5, and all that kind of stuff, as well as all those packages, is not necessarily the way we want an economy to work in the 21st century. And that there is some benefits to having flexible people, flexible workers, have more flexibility for home, from even the worker's perspective, taking time off, doing this, whatever. On the other hand, there's no system that supports that.
That's right.
And so I'm just curious where you would fall in that. You're not necessarily saying, let's go back to that, or are you saying we need to figure out a different thing that works better going forward? Or to talk a little bit about where you're talking.
Another person that we get to work really closely with, who I think is amazing, is a woman, Rachel Schneider, who wrote this book called The Financial Diaries. And she tracks just under 300 families from across the country who are poor working families, and finds that more than being rich, they want stability. That the myth or the caricature that we have of the aspirational American worker who imagines themselves being a millionaire has actually really shifted, in large part because the floor on which they could imagine being a millionaire has sort of crumbled underneath them. And so I'm going to say this again. I don't think that low-wage W-2 workers and low-earning 1099 contractors, I think they're experiencing the same exact financial stress. I think that they're experiencing the same lack of stability, the same lack of opportunity. I feel like they have no hope. They can't imagine retiring. In her book, that's actually the place that I most landed on me, was that people actually aren't thinking about retiring. And that thing, the promised land, was never going to come for the vast majority of the people that she interviewed. And so for me, I don't think it's about an either or, like in either we go back to the old days of 40-hour work week, 40-hour work week, same place, show up, maybe there's some work, maybe there's not. Or now when you like to work whenever you feel like it, which for a lot of poor people is working all the time. I think that there has to be a middle ground. And the myth, I think, that the vast majority of workers, low-wage workers in particular, work 9 to 5, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, was just a myth. They still then were poor, they still worked, 60 hours a week and took care of their kids and did did everything that they needed to do to survive. And so again, I feel like that is an aspirational narrative that we had about poor working people that was not true. And today, that aspirational narrative has translated into the narrative of, I drive Uber for 4 hours a day so I can write poetry 2 hours a day, or I can play my guitar in Dolores Park for 1 hour a day. When what we know is that you're driving Uber for 16 hours a day. And I actually think it's neither nor, and it's how do you make sure that people work 40 hours a week and actually are able to pay rent and have food on the table for every meal, and make sure that their kids and parents are cared for and okay. I think that there are more, the way that we're narrating the lives of working people is so far removed from the actual day-to-day lives of working people and what they want and how they live and what they need. That my hope is that moving forward, we get closer to where they are and are truly able to respond to what they need, so that we can get on sort of a path of economic opportunity in this country.
Interesting. So, but that next system.
Yeah. What does it look like?
Let's call it the 21st century system.
Yep.
If I could extrapolate from where you're going, it's probably going to be more government-led at this stage, at least early stages. It's not going to go back to the old thing, but features of that
Yep.
would be providing these generic needs of people that are more generic, like
Yep.
stability,
Yep.
security,
Yep.
decent living standard,
Yep.
safety.
Yep.
Do you see that system? And I guess it sounds like you're agnostic of whether that system's a system of independent workers who get
Yeah.
those fulfilled, or whether it's
I entirely
wage
do not
workers,
care.
or it doesn't matter. but whatever it is. And so how? Any thoughts as we just end here of the kinds of where that might go? And I'm also curious on how optimistic you might be that we're going to see this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Do you see kind of what could you see emerging here? A little bit on that.
Yeah.
Those attributes we just described, the stability, security. Certainly you can imagine systems that would do that.
Yeah.
And if we had another hour, we can maybe go through that. But why couldn't we do that?
That's a great question.
Or,
Yeah.
or how much have you thought systemically about that?
How to make it happen?
Yeah, how to make that happen.
Yeah, so if one of the needs is this emergency money, it's front of mind for me right now, because I was just with Rachel, and we haven't figured out how to get people the money that they need when they need it. I don't know why we can't create. I'll tell you my idea. So my idea is to find a state or a city that's willing to say, all right, we can create a public fund. We have a public bank. So I think Santa Fe, New Mexico, the mayor established a public bank. Why couldn't we put money in that public bank, and when people wanted or needed $500, they can go in and answer 4 or 5 questions and get that money and pay it back over 3 months with no interest? Well, why couldn't we do that? And so we're actively trying to figure out, well, let's do it. And I think that's the luxury of founding and building and running the Workers Lab, is that I have the room to say, well, why not? Why aren't we? And then to actually have what feels like very real pressure to say, not only why don't we, but how do we? And to put the sort of the wheels on the road and start doing and finding partners, be it Mayor Tubbs in Stockton, this mayor in Santa Fe, or folks in tech here, who are really interested in changing the lives of working people to start doing.
So you're with your lab, start doing it, and how optimistic are you that with time that a more robust, comprehensive systems will evolve in that direction?
Oh God, it really depends on where you live. In California, I'm 60% optimistic, which I feel like is really good. 2018 is going to be a very telling year for this country. We have the first Black woman governor ever, who's set to be elected to be governor of Georgia. Progressive, amazing. The first Black governor of Florida, Stacey Abrams from Georgia, Andrew Gillum in Florida. So there's a promising group of political leaders who see economic opportunity as core to their agenda and ascendance in political office. The question is, can they win, and will they win? And so our work and my work really in the next 18 months is to make sure they win, and to make sure that they have a menu of options available. So when they think about economic opportunity and mobility, it's not just collective bargaining that they're thinking about, but they're thinking about how to use public subsidy to support co-op development. Or they're thinking about how the city, the state of Florida, the state of Georgia, the state of California for example, has a ton of money that it uses for procurement. Why not just say we're only going to buy things from people who pay this amount of money, offer benefits and paid leave to people? Well, they could do that, as you know, we could do that here in California, and we're not. And so I think that I'm hopeful depending on where you live, and I'll be more hopeful in 2018 after we see what happens. Yeah.
We'll have you back for a conversation then. But I think we got to end there. So,
Awesome.
So thanks for a fantastic conversation with Carmen Rojas and the Workers Lab, and it really opened my mind to the difficulties in that space, but also the seeds of hope and seeds of all kinds of things.
I'm glad.
Potentially transformative things to come. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me.